And now I invite Mr. Kaleeswaram Raj to speak to the second theme under this, sub-theme, shall we say, under safeguarding India's democracy, which is future-proofing the Constitution. So is there a way we can future-proof a Constitution from being eroded, from the guarantees, rights, protections that are due to us, keeping them intact? Mr. Kaleeswaram Raj.
Dear friends, thank you first of all to Asian College of Journalism for providing me this rather captivating topic, which in fact tempts me to brood over certain things as part of my self-education. Future-proofing necessarily involves the present day's preservation for the purpose of future as well. So that really is something touching the past, present, and the future. Recently, I came across a study which was brought out by Chicago University, which rather demolished even my romanticism about the constitutions and constitutionalism, for that matter. The study has the title, Lifespan of Written Constitutions. That says 3 academics of Chicago University conducted a survey of written constitutions across the globe after the year 1789. And the average lifespan was assessed to be 17 years, 17 years. So how far a constitution can last, and sometimes how can the constitutional values can last, is rather answered in a terrific way in the study, which is essentially an empirical study. This really poses a lot of questions in rather across the world, especially in the contemporary scenario. And these same authors spell out certain specific reasons for the death of constitutions. And one, of course, is war, military coup, understandable. And they also say the reason as simple regime change. This is, again, is something shocking. And that, again, as I try to indicate, is an empirical reality. You find a lot of countries, speakers in the morning session, pre-lunch session, have also indicated that democracies die in different ways. And I was rather thinking sometimes that how do constitutions emerge? Constitutions sometimes emerge after some kind of struggle, protest, like Indian freedom struggle, or some other democratic revolution, bloody or otherwise. But how do constitutions die? I think sometimes constitutions die through elections. Elections which are designed by the constitutions or the institutions envisaged by the constitution. That's how in so many populist regimes across the globe, take the case of Brazil, Hungary, Russia, Venezuela, Poland, Philippines, and so many other nations, which we call as populist regimes or electoral autocracies. So constitutions challenge, the global constitutionalism face an unprecedented, unique challenge, and India also is not an exception. So how do you assess the ongoing scenario? Dr. Anushka was talking about the free speech jurisprudence in the country, though in a rather academic angle, but we also know how the realities are confronted by the nation, how we suffer the atmosphere of hatred, of fear, and how far we are rather deconstitutionalized ourselves. This was a theme which I attempted to indicate with all my limitations, because I am essentially not an academic. I am only a litigation lawyer, and my experiences are rather limited in that way. But I find two things. First of all, before coining this word, deconstitutionalization, especially after the 2014 regime, Modi won, a parallel question emerges as to how far, as a nation, we have constitutionalized ourselves. In the morning session, Justice Chalameshwar was pleased to make an interesting observation regarding the idea of constitutional morality. Dr. Ambedkar used it in two planes. One is at the individual level, but the emphasis which Dr. Ambedkar has been repeatedly giving was on the institutional level. Constitutional morality, of course, as Justice Chalameshwar rightly put it, in certain spheres it depends, it is rather subjective. You can have your view of constitutional morality. Another person can have his own view or her own view on that. That is one part of it, but not the sole part of it, I think. The second part would be rather, according to Dr. Ambedkar, as he indicated, constitutional morality is essentially institutional morality. That's why once you destroy the institutions, you are in a way destroying the constitutional framework for invocation of its culture and morality and even its politics into the nation. So what happens when the institutions are ruined? Very many persons compare the present situation of hatred, fear, or the aggrandizing state, as we usually call it, as something akin to the situation which the country faced during emergency, national emergency, third emergency in fact, chronologically. But we know, when we talk about emergency, it is Mrs. Gandhi's emergency, 75-77, 1975-77. I have a different view on that. Emergency was a situation which was rather envisaged by the Constitution's own provisions. It so happens. Constitution itself carves out certain provisions for its own destruction, ironically. And that's why thinkers like Giorgio Agamben talks about state of exception, where whatever he only studied about certain Western constitutions, including that of Germany and certain other European countries, not the Indian constitution, and said that you will find whatever liberal, democratic your constitution is, you will nevertheless find out certain provisions in the very same constitution which is capable of undoing the liberty, the fraternity, the equality, and what all promised by the Constitution. That is how the emergency happens. You invoke Article 352 to destroy the entire Part 3, fundamental rights. In that way. Or in certain other situations, you invoke 356, as Sasikumar was telling in the morning session, and even our talks, Nehru invoked 356. Justice Chandru also was. So these are all situations where it is not on account of certain extra constitutional means that the freedom is curtailed or that the democracy is limited. It is rather done by making use of the Constitution's own apparatus. Coming back to the national emergency, we all know that after the national emergency, we had an election. And in the election, the fifth pillar of the democratic constitution, or if I can use the idea of Granville Austin, the wing, the pillar which supported the constitution could act. And that gave a formidable reply, a pupil's response to Mrs. Gandhi's regime, to the national emergency. That happened because even after the emergency, according to my polite reading on that, the institutions were not damaged, as it has happened in recent years. Because the institutions were not damaged, there was a populace which was capable of exercising the franchise. But in the contemporary scenario of erosion of democratic ethos, institutions are rather derailed, diluted, weakened in such a way that even the election becomes a kind of farce where the public at large are not capable of forming a correct opinion. On the other hand, the consent is often manufactured, as Noam Chomsky famously described it. Sometimes by media, sometimes by social media, sometimes by other means. And often by way of this electoral bond, which was a pertinent question which fell from the audience in the morning session. So in the post-national emergency election, there was no electoral bond situation. The institutions, including particularly the election commission, acted relatively in a free and fair manner. The public opinion was not contaminated by way of extraneous factors. This is how institutions preserve democracy. In fact, Granville Austin himself, in his seminal work, Indian Constitution, Cornerstone of a Nation, emphasizes much on this election part of the democratic process. As the rhetoric goes, the tiny person with a tiny ballot, doing it on a tiny paper, makes the miracles in democracy. And that has been the surest check against abuse of power, as Granville Austin himself indicated. But in modern times, just as in India, and also elsewhere, it so happens that the system erodes, along with the erosion in the institutions envisaged by the Constitution. This is really a big threat, which is indirect, sometimes even invisible, but nevertheless it is real and strong. And how the institutions, including the court, work. I have quoted David Landau and Rosalind Dixon at so many occasions in the work also. They titled the paper as Abusive Judicial Review when they talked about courts. Abusive Judicial Review. And the subtitle was Courts Against Democracy. And somewhere they say that the biggest threat to democracy could be judiciary. That's a rather a radical view, which I think even though, or at least one among the authors has diluted subsequently, because Rosalind herself came out with a subsequent work, Responsive Judicial Review, which rather dilutes the concept. There could be situations where you can nevertheless use judiciary as an institution that will help, as the title goes, future-proofing the Constitution. So this is a possibility. But how does we get back these possibilities? First of all, Constitution is like, sometimes Constitution is like Marxism. You may have a lot of theory, you may have a lot of practice, you may have a lot of praxis in it. But unless and until you educate and you make the masses experiencing that praxis, Marxism doesn't work, and it has not worked elsewhere, even in India, and the Constitution also doesn't work. In that way, I think that how far we have constitutionalized ourselves is one question. But nevertheless, the fact remains that contrasting the Indian experience and contrasting the success story of our Constitution, at least as opined by Granville Austin and others like him, against the constitutions elsewhere, there are a lot of things which we could gather, we could rather attain. For example, I would say in Thailand, which is essentially a kind of constitutional monarch, one author has compared the Thai constitution with an electoral manifesto. And in some other European country, when somebody went to a bookstall and asked for the text, a textbook on their constitution, the shopkeeper was telling, sorry, we don't sell periodicals. So that kind of thing has not happened in India. That is why this is relatively a success story, as Granville Austin could reasonably proclaim. But then, all of a sudden, simply by way of a majority that could be gathered as a result of an election, and by simply capturing the institutions, by its own propaganda, as it has happened right from the period of Second World War or prior to that, the regime is capable of brainwashing. So, as a result, it so happens that elections are no longer a guarantee for future-proofing or protecting the rights or even saving democracy for that matter. This is a big change that has happened post-emergency. That's why calling this as an informal emergency, etc., in my view, doesn't make sense. It requires rather a deeper study to understand the causes. I think in order to regain the institutional framework, as the recent experiences show, at least to a certain extent, the country shows us that even the damaged institutions may not be capable of fulfilling the aspirations of the fundamental law. But sometimes it so happens that civil society movements as it has happened in the agitation against farm laws, against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which Mr. Ram also has written extensively in that small, beautiful book on CAA, along with certain other authors. In all these things, one finds that even when the institutions, including the fourth estate, which may not be a formal institution, but we generally call as institutionalized anarchy, the fourth estate. Even when the four estates fail, all the four pillars break down, there is the potential with the fifth pillar. It's not the Supreme Court that facilitated or rather compelled the repealing of farm laws. It was the agitation for which, of course, the farmers had to, or agitators had to pay a heavy cost. So, therefore, it should not be required, it should not be rather warranted to sacrifice this much for undoing an unconstitutional law. That is the whole purpose of the Constitution. That is the whole purpose of the Supreme Court, or whole purpose of the High Courts. But that doesn't happen. Then agitations occur. So in a way, all written constitutions create a kind of advocacy for non-violence, because you are to use the institutions, not to resort to a bloody revolution, is what all the constitutions imply. But when the institutions fail, the very object of the Constitution also fails, as it happens elsewhere. It can rather happen in multiple ways. It can happen as it happened in Sri Lanka. It can, when the governance is bad. An earlier study, 1995 study, I suppose, on Indian Constitution found that 2/3 of the constitutional provisions are on governance. So, it is the fair governance that maintains everything else. But how does governance happen? And a significant question was asked by Mark Tushnet, the legal scholar, in a tiny book. Why Constitution Matters? That was the title. And he answered that question right in the introduction. Not that Constitution matters because it protects your fundamental rights. No. Constitution matters because it helps to maintain a politics which is capable of preserving your fundamental rights. I think that after the 2014 shift in Indian politics, we have essentially failed in politics. That's the reason why the entire tenets of the country's fundamental law have fallen down in one way or other. When the center encroaches into the kind of domain of the state governments, elected governments, even without resorting to 356, then there is no point in having a tall talk on federalism. When the parliament enacts and the state legislature enacts laws right from Citizenship Amendment Act to this so-called anti-love jihad laws, within inverted comma, there is no secularism left. When hatred is rather injected, even in legislations, the conventional theory is that legislature cannot have an ill motive. You cannot challenge it on the ground of malice. Because law presumes, constitution presumes, that every enactment is done in good faith. But we know what happens with respect to the triple talaq, criminalization of triple talaq. Of course, triple talaq criminalization has happened after the Supreme Court holding that the instant triple talaq is void ab initio in the eye of law, so that it doesn't have a legal sense. It is not a legal occurrence, which doesn't therefore require any punishment. It is non-est. But nevertheless, the parliament legislated over that, thereby meaning, and ultimately what happened is rather curious. First of all, very many Muslim husbands chose to make this, not to make the triple talaq, but simply desert the wife so that the law doesn't affect them. It's very simple as it is. And even a lawyer would advise that. Secondly, suppose an innocent husband did it, ignorantly or innocently, then what follows is, he is punished and sent to jail. And that results in a situation where this otherwise deserted Muslim wife is further orphaned, at least in terms of maintenance. Because what one gathers from jail is not sufficient enough to maintain the wife. This kind of legislations happen. And when this kind of legislations happen, there is no secularism. When there is fear and hatred created statutorily and or otherwise, there is no constitutional fraternity. So preamble is shattered, part 3 is shattered, and directive principles, even that which are legally enforceable, are given a go-by. Then part 4, of course, as we know, are only the dreams of the nation, which right from equal pay, living wages, maternity care, the child care, measures against monopolization, equal distribution of resources, etc., etc. Needless to say that the whole part is ignored, as we see in the recent times. The resources are rather set apart, assigned to selected few. And even among the tycoons, there is a further division. The favorite, most fortunate persons are given the large share of the country's resources. This is how it happens. And in such a scenario, I would think that the future proofing is not an easy task. It requires continuous constitutional education, not just by textual means or rather pedagogical means, but rather by means of sheer crude economic measures. That is how good governance matters. The best answer, probably given in the recent times, to what has been happening across the country has been, to a certain extent at least, instances of good governance in regional levels. That may last, but not even just electoral victory that one could have, say, in West Bengal or elsewhere. But models of good governance, to a certain extent, that the lessons from Kerala and the lessons from Tamil Nadu, I am not idealizing them, I am saying that in a rather relative context, may help us in future proofing the better values of the fundamental law. Therefore, there are certain measures which are essentially political measures, which we need to evolve even to protect the institutions. When we fail in politics, we fail in law. Therefore, as things happen now. I think it's not an easy task. It requires a struggle. And all the time, whenever constitutional freedom or other guarantees were under threat, it needed some sacrifice, political sacrifice. Probably in the years to come, there may be a requirement to use the Constitution as a political tool, not in courts, not in the institutions alone, but by the masses, across the streets, across the fields, across the villages. With these thoughts on it, and perhaps by quoting, as we always do during hard times, quoting from Gramsci's prison notes, we can try to have that pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've had two fascinating presentations, one by Anushka Singh, a scholarly treatise on how language matters, how speech, how its connotations, which really gave us an idea of, Wittgenstein's idea of how the limits of my language are the limits of my world. It seems that the limits of the language actually nuances the way, as she said, the performative and the different ways of expression of language. We had Kaleeswaram Raj. Earlier in the morning, we were speaking about constitutional morality, and it struck me that we had him giving us a sense of intimations of constitutional mortality, if you like, So we have moved. So we have a real problem, and the question that he raised is something probably which we haven't thought of. Do constitutions die? If so, how? Or are constitutions limited in terms of their longevity? Are we expressing too much hope and faith in the durability of constitutions and their ability to carry our democracy through, and so on and so forth? I'm sure there'll be some discussion on all of these aspects. But to get this going into an interactive session, we have two discussants who will speak to the subjects that the key speakers addressed.